No, they blocked me.
So
Wouldn't be the first. But I don't find them.
we're officially streaming on Facebook, by the way. Hi, Brock. I allowed you to talk.
Well, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
So you need the link, right?
Yeah, I just need the API token, if you can, please.
I will send it over to you. I just sent it in a chat.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Mhm.
Just give me 2 seconds and I will integrate the captions.
Did I send you the right link?
Yes, it's just taking me a bit.
Just making sure.
And you should be seeing them now.
Yep, I see them.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll start in a minute or two to give folks a couple more minutes to join. So we'll start in about 2 minutes. All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on framing bilingualism as a resource in Common Core aligned classrooms. In a moment, I'm going to turn this over to our guest speaker, Dr. Nelson Flores, but I'll just begin by briefly explaining the goals of the webinar series for the Center on Standards, Alignment, Instruction, and Learning, or CSAIL, for the newcomers to our series. And as a quick note for this webinar, all attendees are muted for the duration of the webinar, but when we get to the end, when we have Q&A time, since we have a small group today, I might just allow everybody to unmute themselves. And if you wish to unmute yourself and weigh in with a question, we can do that at the end. If you do have questions during today's presentation, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. And if you see a question that somebody else wrote that you'd like to emphasize, please go ahead and click the thumbs up on that question or use the comment box to ask a follow-up question. And we do offer closed captioning, as some of you may have noticed at the bottom of the screen. If you don't see your captions coming up, you may have to click on the CC symbol at the bottom of your screen. And the transcript of today's conversation will also appear on the side once you click on that arrow that's next to the CC symbol. And lastly, we are streaming this via Facebook Live on our CSAIL Facebook page. And that's where you can also access a recording of this video afterwards if you'd like to share it on social media. Okay. So CSAIL is a federally funded research center with 4 different strands of research. The first strand, the implementation team, has been investigating the implementation of content standards and related supports across the states of California, Massachusetts, Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. For these past 4 years, we've collected hundreds of interviews and survey responses from educational leaders and teachers about their experiences with standards implementation, including their experiences with supporting students with disabilities and English learners. We also have 3 other strands of research that you can actually hear more about at our conference, which I'll talk about at the end, and it's happening in May 2020. And so we developed this webinar series because we consistently heard from our interviews and surveys that as a field, we need to develop and disseminate more strategies for supporting students with disabilities and English learners in this context of standards-based reform. So given the wide-ranging achievement levels and the wide spectrum of diversity in our classrooms, how do we differentiate to meet students where they are, and how do we leverage their diversity as assets while attending to rigorous standards-based instruction? How can educational policymakers and leaders provide these supports effectively and widely? And we've invited Nelson to present his work today because his participation as a researcher on the CSAIL team has really shaped our thinking about language, instruction, and bilingualism in critical ways. Nelson will share from some of his broader work in this field and connect his research to the demands for EL differentiation in today's context of standards-based reform. So thank you again, Nelson, for joining us, and I will now switch the slides over. So if you'd like to start, I can work on creating, switching over the slides.
Sure. So thank you so much for everyone for joining today. So as you can see, what I'm hoping to talk a little bit about today is how to frame bilingualism as a resource, in particular in meeting the demands of the Common Core state standards. And so I want to begin by just talking about the different terms that I have heard in the field to describe bilingual students of color. So the most prominent one that I'm sure many of you have heard is an English learner. Another one that I'm going to be thinking about more critically today is this idea that they lack academic language. And a related concept is that because of this lack of academic language, that these students actually lack a strong foundation in any language. Now, as someone who does linguistics, I can tell you that that's not an actual objective way of describing anybody. Everybody has a strong foundation in the language practice that they're socialized into in their communities. And yet, many of our students who are coming in with multiple languages into classrooms are being described as essentially lacking any real language. And that's what I would like us to think more critically about today. And I hope that this reframe will also help us to think about how we can support these students to meet the needs of the standards differently. And so I think that these deficit perspectives lead to a dynamic of teachers being positioned as language police, as people who need to monitor and fix the language practices of their students. And so what this boils down to in classrooms is that schools are conceptualized from this perspective as a place where students should engage in, quote, academic language. And I'll leave those scare quotes there for now because we're going to deconstruct that a little bit in the next slides. And the idea is that students come into school without a strong foundation in this academic language, and that the role of the teacher is to enforce the rules of academic language, to ensure that students develop what this academic language concept is, right? And so teachers are then expected to monitor and police students so that students are able to replicate or reproduce this academic language. And what this essentially does then is position students as what I call language robots, essentially expecting students to mindlessly follow the teacher's rules for both languages, right? Either English or another language if you're in a bilingual program. And what this means is that there's no opportunity to reflect on language variation. There's no opportunity for incorporating their home language practices into school tasks. And there's no opportunity for them to develop their voice as speakers and authors. And so what this essentially means is that students are expected to simply reproduce what the teacher is telling them to do without actually having the opportunity to reflect on why they're doing this, how they might be able to do things differently. But if you look closely at the Common Core state standards, I would argue that that's actually not what the standards are asking for students to be able to do. So just looking briefly at some of the anchor statements for reading and writing, you can see that in terms of reading, one of the anchor statements wants students to be able to analyze how specific word choices shape meaning or tone. It doesn't say anything about academic language per se. It says how specific word choices shape meaning or tone. And if we look at writing, in addition to writing narratives, which is one of the anchor statements, there's also a discussion of thinking about writing that's appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. Again, no mention of academic language per se, but rather thinking about how to use language in ways that's appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. Now, this next quote over here by Gloria Anzaldúa from Borderlands La Frontera, I think in many ways we could argue is Common Core standards aligned. So we can see what she's saying here, right? Ser habladora was to be a gossip and a liar, to talk too much. Muchachitas bien criadas, well-bred girls, don't answer back. Es una falta de respeto to talk back to one's mother or father. And then she continues, right? And so I would argue that Gloria Anzaldúa is certainly a text that one could use to think about how specific word choices shape meaning or tone. In particular, her decision to use Spanish and English simultaneously in her writing certainly shapes the meaning or tone that readers may develop from it. In addition, we can think about the ways that Anzaldúa as a writer was constructing a text that's appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. It might get us to think about what is the task that she is laying out for herself here. My hypothesis or my analysis would suggest that her task is to describe her lived experience as someone who was bilingual growing up on the Mexican-US border, and the ways that she cannot represent these experiences without using both languages. A brief example being habladora is a term that literally translates to English as talkative or someone who talks a lot, but has a particular gendered connotation in the ways that it's oftentimes mobilized in Spanish, that she would not be able to articulate in English, right? So she has to use Spanish to reflect the ways that this particular term was used to monitor her language practices as a woman, as a girl, and then as a woman. So Anzaldúa is doing all kinds of complex things here that I think are really aligned to what the standards are asking for our students to be able to do. And the good news is that bilingual students of color who grow up in the US can already do these things, right? They can already do these things that Anzaldúa is doing here. And that's the type of experiences that she's trying to represent in her writing. And so this kind of then suggests to me that the Common Core standards aren't necessarily requesting or demanding that students develop, quote, academic language, but rather that students engage in what I call language architecture. And so what I mean by language architecture is the ability to manipulate language for specific purposes. And so language architects take what they know about general conventions of language use in order to create their own unique voice in both their speaking and writing. Now, a language architect isn't able to just do whatever they want. I think sometimes people misconstrue my argument to be suggesting that people should just be able to do and say whatever they want. And the reason that they can't do that is because that's not how language works, right? We engage in language in order to connect with other people, in order to communicate with other people. And so the idea that someone would create a language that nobody else understood would be equivalent to an architect creating a building that wasn't based on principles of design that meant that the building was unsafe, right? The building would literally collapse. And so, but within those general conventions of what we do to connect and be understood by other people, there's lots of flexibility and there's lots of interesting things that people are constantly doing with language on a daily basis. And bilingual students of color have unique affordances in thinking about the complexities of how language works, precisely because they're navigating across at least 2, if not more, languages on a daily basis in the ways that Anzaldúa was describing in her writing. And so just to give you a sense of some examples of language architecture in action that I've observed in classrooms that I work in. One was a conversation about whether the N-word with an A at the end can be used as a term of endearment. One student used the term with an A at the end to refer to another student. Another student intervened and thought it was a bad word and that they shouldn't be using it. And then they had a really interesting conversation about whether it was a good word or a bad word, which of course is a conversation that adults don't agree on. Another example, which I see every day in the classrooms I work in, is discussions of the best way to translate a particular English word into Spanish. Translation is never a simple, straightforward process, right? There are different connotations about words as they exist in one language or another. For example, what I just did with habladora before was to try to show that it doesn't quite translate neatly into English and that you need to explain a little bit more of the context for people to understand that translation. Another example that I've observed is whether the term amigos is in fact gender neutral, as many suggest. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Spanish, the O at the end is typically used to refer to masculine. So if I had someone who identified as a man who was my friend, I would use amigo. If I had someone who identified as a woman, I would use amiga, right? But if there is a mixed group of people of different genders, then I would use amigos. And the idea is that that's gender neutral and includes everybody. There's debates among adults about whether that in fact is gender neutral, with some people suggesting alternatives such as amigues or amiguex. But this is, again, something that I've observed children observing in classrooms and really thinking about the politics of that in classrooms. And so these were all examples of language architectures that I observed among students who were from kindergarten to second grade in a dual language charter school in a low-income, primarily Latinx area of Philadelphia. And so while the literature oftentimes suggests that these students lack academic language and that they need to be taught academic language, my observations of them suggest that they actually have a very nuanced and sophisticated understanding of how language works, the politics of language, and how they can manipulate language for specific purposes for particular effects. And so for me, this leads to then a reframe. Rather than thinking of students as English learners, we could first describe them as bi and multilingual, which they are. But then rather than describing them as lacking academic language or not having a strong foundation in any language, what we could do is consider them language architects who engage in a range of language practices across multiple language varieties on a daily basis and who are able to shift language to accommodate their audience. This is good news for us because if they can already do this, what this essentially means is that they can already do what the Common Core standards are asking them to do if we're able to hear those language practices and recognize them. And so one way to bring this into classrooms is through the use of translingual mentor texts. So translingual mentor texts are texts that are primarily written in one language, where the author uses another language as part of the construction of the text. The Anzaldúa quote that I presented before would be an example of a translingual text. These are different than dual language texts, where a text might have an English and then it might have the translation of that. You can do lots of interesting activities with dual language text as well from this perspective, but I'm going to be focusing on the use of translingual text for this particular presentation. And I would love to hear thoughts from people about how you could see us using dual language text as well. And so the way that we thought about kind of organizing the unit plan was to think about doing close readings of a text that engages in translingual strategies. Of course, close reading being a Common Core aligned literacy strategy. And then using these as mentor texts that children can then use to construct their own translingual stories using the same rhetorical strategies that were used by the author. So a word of caution when engaging with translingual texts: some texts that seemingly engage in translingual strategies may actually be engaging in mock language. And so some warning signs may be the use of inauthentic or incorrect uses of language, things like no problemo, muy chipo, ay caramba. The dangers of these texts is not necessarily just with the incorrect use of language, but oftentimes that these texts are actually reinforcing and perpetuating the stereotypes that the idea of the translingual text we're trying to use is trying to kind of challenge, right? So if in doubt, if you're using a translingual text in a language that you're not familiar with, it's always a good idea to consult with someone who is more competent or more comfortable in that language first in order to get a sense of whether it's actually engaging in authentic translingual strategies or whether it's engaging in mock language and perpetuating stereotypes. And so just to give you an outline of the unit that we developed around the story Abuela, which is a story that's written primarily in English, though includes Spanish for Abuela's dialogue. And of course, Abuela is only referred to as Abuela in the text. So the day one is just introducing the students to the text. It was a traditional read aloud that any elementary school classroom, you probably are familiar with, those of you who work in elementary school classrooms. And then day two was intended to both model a close reading of Abuela for students and model for them how to use insights from this close reading to write their own bilingual stories. And in this day 2, the close reading was looking at the author's decision to have Abuela's dialogue in Spanish and how that changes the characterization of Abuela and what that means about her as a person. The third day was a second day of close reading, where here they were looking at this particular author's decision to construct the text in a way that provided clues for readers who may not understand Spanish, so that they could still understand what Abuela was saying, regardless of whether they actually read Spanish. So not all people who engage in translingual writing will use those strategies, and Zaldúa does not always translate everything that she does, that she is saying in Spanish, but this particular author decided to offer those clues or those translations, and so this day was looking closely at how this author decided to do that. Day 4 was a culminating reading of Abuela that provided students a final opportunity to experience the bilingualism of the text through a kind of reader's theater type activity. And then day 5, we left as an open day, just because based on previous experiences in my works with teachers, they oftentimes don't have the time to get through everything in a day and sometimes appreciate that extra day. Although we did include some extension activities if a teacher were able to get through all of the lessons in the 4 days. Just to kind of give you a sense, when we piloted it, and I'm gonna share that pilot in the next slide, there actually was a snow day on one of the days, and so that became the open day. And so I piloted this unit plan with a teacher in a Philadelphia school. It's a different school than the one that I was talking about before. It's actually a traditional district public school, but it's in the same neighborhood, so it's similar demographics, 100% economically disadvantaged, 74% Latinx, 25% English learner, which is far higher than the district average of 10%. This was a second grade class. It was a fairly small class because it was a transitional class that was turning into a dual language class. But all of the students came from homes where Spanish was spoken, and most of the students, according to traditional standardized assessments used by the school, were reading below grade level, at least 1 grade below grade level, many of them also reading at the kindergarten level. And so just to give you a sense of how the close reading worked, here's Ms. Lopez on the second day of the close reading, modeling a think aloud for the students about how the author provided clues for students as they constructed the text.
Dios House. She tells me, "Mijo, ¿me puedes cargar a tu primo bebé, por favor?" And I told her,
okay, so there's some type of technical glitch, so I'll just read it. So she says, "Today, we are going to the park. El parque es lindo," says Abuela. I know what she means. I think the park is beautiful, too. So I'm going to think about that for a second. In Spanish, Abuela said, "El parque es lindo." But then Arthur Doros, the author, he puts in here, "I think the park is beautiful, too." So that's a clue for me. If I don't know what El Parque es Lindo means, I still understand what Abuela is saying because he wrote, "I think the park is beautiful too." So Arthur Doros is kind of translating here for us. You see how he did that? So this is her doing a think aloud model in close reading. Remember, these are second graders, so this is the first time they're engaging in the literacy practice of close reading. And so it's heavily scaffolded, but it's Ms. Lopez showing the students how you could approach a particular close reading, looking at this particular rhetorical strategy that was used by the author. And she does this several times as part of her mini lesson. And then, to give you a sense of, it looks like, okay, so now to give you a sense of how the, and I'll just probably just read it. How this worked in terms of the shared writing. So she would do the read aloud, right? She would do the close reading modeling, and then they would go and do a shared writing where she would model for them the types of things that they were going to be practicing in their independent writing. So this was the first day of the unit where the only thing the students were expected to do was to draw a picture of a special person in their life who spoke Spanish and label it. So this is Ms. Lopez modeling for them how they're going to do it. And so she says, "I'm just going to write here that we're making an apple cake because maybe people don't know, that's an apple cake. So I'm going to label it apple cake. But you know what? Actually, I don't even call it apple cake. We call it torta de manzana. Maybe I'll write that. And so she's labeling it in Spanish to begin to help the students to see that when they construct their text, some of the text is going to be in Spanish, modeled after both the story that they read and modeled after her example. And so you can see then that when they begin to actually write the story, where torta de manzana appears in the text. And so Miss Lopez is writing the story, and she says, so since I drew about her teaching me how to make a torta de manzana, I need to put that in my story. And then she begins to write the story, right? She taught, that's a tricky word, but you know how to, this is how it's spelled. Yeah, taught is a tricky word. Me how to make, and you can't really get the full effect because the students are reading along and you don't really hear it. And then all of them say, torta de manzana. And one of the students gets really excited and says, there's a Spanish word in there. And Miss Lopez says, yes, here. So as they were constructing the story, the students kept on asking Miss Lopez, when is the Spanish going to appear? Because the lessons had been scaffolded enough that they were expecting Spanish to appear. And so they were all very excited when they finally saw the first Spanish word appear in the text. And this is just one of the examples of a story who wrote the story. I think that was actually the audio clip that was playing before. And so unfortunately, the audio doesn't seem to be working, so we can't have the student read it to us, but I can read it on his behalf. And so he says here, when I go to my tia house, she tells me, mijo, ¿me puedes cargar a tu primo bebé, por favor? And I tell her, yes, tia. And my tia says, gracias, mijo. And so when Ms. Lopez and I were looking at this written piece at the end of the unit, what we determined was that this student was able to successfully utilize the translingual strategy of providing authentic dialogue in Spanish for a character who prefers to speak in Spanish, or a real person who prefers to speak in Spanish. And in terms of providing a clue, which was the other strategy that we wanted them to practice, we determined that the student had an emerging kind of understanding of providing a clue, because he does say, and I tell her, yes, tia, which suggests that a request was made, but there isn't a clear sense from the clues that he provides what that request was. Now, you may notice the picture is hard to see. There is a picture of somebody holding a baby. So when I presented this to teachers before, some people suggested that perhaps that was the clue, which is certainly a possibility, though it wasn't necessarily one of the strategies that we talked about for that particular unit. And so it wasn't one of the strategies that the author was using of Abuela in order to provide clues to students, to readers. And so kind of what this suggests to me is kind of moving away from deficit framings of bilingual students of color towards a resource framing of students. So sociolinguistically, when we look at what children do with language, bilingual children engage in language architecture as part of their daily lives. We all do, everyone does. That's just how language works, right? Language is a tool that people manipulate for particular purposes, for particular effects. And that pedagogically, what this means is teachers building on this foundation to support students in exploring new language and literacy practices. So in school, inevitably, students are going to be introduced to tasks that may require language practices that are new or different or unfamiliar to them. The most effective way of helping them to become comfortable with those language practices is to connect it to the knowledge that they already have. So just as when we take Content 101, the first thing that we learn is that for students to remember new content that needs to be connected to their prior knowledge. My argument is that it works the same for language. In order for students to be able to learn and internalize new language practices, we have to connect it to language practices that they're already familiar with. And the good news here is that the underlying skills that are required to engage in the types of tasks that are required in school are skills that the students already have as people who've been socialized into language. And so I just kind of want to reiterate kind of at the end, that though my work focuses on bilingual students, that the framework that I'm suggesting has implications beyond bilingualism. And so I wanted to end with a quote from James Baldwin, who wrote an essay in the early 70s called "If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is," where he argues, "A child cannot be taught by anyone whose demand essentially is that the child repudiate his experience and all that gives him sustenance, and enter a limbo in which he will no longer be Black and in which he knows that he can never become white." And so my argument is that the academic language framework that suggests that the language demands of school are dichotomous with the language that's used in homes is essentially telling students that to repudiate their experiences at home, the experiences that give them sustenance, and puts them into this limbo where they feel like they don't belong at home, but they also don't belong at school. And I think that that's not a message that we want our children to have. We want our children to understand that their home languages, their home culture is an integral part of the development of their academic identities. And the best way to do that is to begin by acknowledging the rich knowledge that they already come in with. And so I think that's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Nelson. That was very educational and informative, and I really appreciate you doing this webinar with us. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in. We do have one question here already.
Yeah.
How do we work with deaf students who may have missed the window of language learning in their early years? They didn't have a foundational language until they entered school. If this is off track, please feel free.
No, it's definitely not off track. I'll preface my answer with I'm not an expert in deaf education. What I've learned from kind of reading the important work being done by deaf scholars specifically on the issue. And my answer to that first would be, I think that the deaf situation is a very unique situation that's different than the situation of non-deaf children, in that oftentimes, because there's a stigma on teaching children sign language, they actually are being deprived of language, right? And so I think that the first kind of answer I would have there is the importance of raising awareness on the importance of introducing sign language to children who are deaf at a young age, precisely so that they're able to develop foundational language that they can then build on in the future. In terms of what to do with students who haven't developed that foundational language, my understanding of the issue is that it's always best to introduce sign language whenever possible, so that children can begin to develop those skills. But again, I would defer to the important work being done by deaf scholars on that issue. But I think that something that you're bringing up is important for us to consider, in that deaf education oftentimes isn't considered bilingual education. People, when they think of bilingual education, they're not necessarily thinking of that. But of course, someone who has learned sign language has to then learn, in the context of the US, English in order to be able to read and write, right? So it's always going to be bilingual education, and it's a bilingual education context that hasn't gotten the type of attention that it needs, and from all scholars, including myself. So I appreciate the question, because you're pushing me to think more about how language architecture might work in the context of deaf education. And I'm going to kind of think more about that and appreciate the question.
Yeah, that's great. So just so everyone knows, I gave everyone permission to talk if you would like to unmute yourself and weigh in with a question. And so, oh, we have another question here. Do you think that a pedagogy that is structured around the metaphor of language learners as architects might be a solution to the issue of creating long-term ELLs?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on long-term ELLs, and I've actually written some on that. I mean, I think that language architecture certainly provides a useful point of entry for understanding the rich linguistic and cultural practices that students who are classified as long-term English learners engaging on a daily basis. So when I was a high school teacher, many moons ago now, my students mostly were students who were identified as long-term English learners. And precisely, and I found myself using precisely the frameworks that I was criticizing in this presentation to make sense of them. I positioned them as lacking academic English and lacking academic Spanish, and that was why they weren't doing well in school. But I quickly became uncomfortable with that framing precisely because I saw them engaged in all kinds of complex linguistic practices across English and Spanish on a daily basis. So I began to question how can it be possible for students who I observed using English and Spanish on a daily basis very fluidly, doing all kinds of interesting, funny, complex things, how could they be not proficient in any language? It doesn't make sense to me. So I do think language architecture provides an alternative framework for analyzing those students. Now, whether it provides a solution to the issue, I think it probably provides part of a solution because the construction of long-term English learner is a complex thing, right? It's all what's primarily determined based on assessments that are getting increasingly harder, precisely because the idea is that you want students to be, you don't want students to test out of English learner status until they're able to meet grade level standards, is the idea of what these assessments are trying to do now. And so oftentimes long-term English learners who come from low income backgrounds are in schools that are high poverty schools, where for many, many different reasons, students are not meeting grade level standards. And we can kind of talk about why that is. So for me, the long-term English learner categorization can't be understood as just a language issue, that it really needs to be understood as part of the broader kind of political and economic context of where these students are going to school and how their peers are also being served or not being served.
Thank you for that question and response. If anybody else has a question, feel free to jump in. So there's a question about how can we translate these practices to first-year college classrooms, particularly with regard to the use of vernacular language in papers, presentations, etc.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a distraction at all, right? I think that in some ways that's kind of the next conversation, right? It's like if you're doing this stuff in K-12, what does this mean at the college setting? And there has been work primarily coming from composition and rhetoric on translingualism that I think has begun to grapple with some of these issues. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Suresh Kanagaraja, Mingzan Liu, Bruce Horner, who are thinking about these issues more deeply at the college level. But my sense of it as someone who is more at the K-12, but who works with graduate students at the college, at the kind of university level, is that I think the general principles apply across the different contexts. So for me, one of the first things to think about are what types of text are being included, as in the K-12 context, we call them mentor text. I know we probably wouldn't call them that at the college level, but what text are you introducing students to? And I would encourage people to think about text and engage in more translingual practices. Translingual being across different named languages, but also across different varieties within English, right? And allowing students to really think about the complex choices that authors are making when they engage in those rhetorical strategies and how then they can then incorporate that into their own writing, right? As actual authors who are constructing text for themselves. So I think what it boils down to for me is across all ages, really positioning students as real authors of the text that they're constructing, who can make decisions about the text that they're constructing in ways that make sense to them, and in ways that they're able to articulate from the perspective of author's craft, right? As something that they're doing, not just because they're doing it, but because they're thinking about how they're constructing text for particular purposes and for particular effects. And I think in some ways, the older children get, the more kind of in-depth those conversations can be. So I was working with second graders. So at the second grade level, we're just trying to get them to kind of understand that you can write a text translingually, right? And what are some of the strategies? Once you get older, you can begin to think about kind of the politics around it in different ways, right? And you can think about kind of the positioning, how you're positioning yourself in ways that are maybe a little more kind of in-depth than what you would do with young children. But I think that that's an excellent question. And I think that in some ways, it's almost even harder to even begin to have those conversations at the college level than it is in K-12 sometimes. And I'm not saying it's easy in the K-12, but in some ways, the gatekeeping, I think, is stronger in college level sometimes, and kind of oftentimes makes people think that they can't do that. But I actually have my graduate students do translingual projects as part of their professional development and thinking about how they may be able to use that approach with their students. And I've always gotten positive reactions about it.
Okay, thank you. So how has the use of translingual texts like abuela and translingual writing impacted more linguistically sustaining assessments? Or do you see this more in instruction, but stops when students are then assessed in more monolingual ways?
Hi, Kadla. I know her. Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly is an important follow-up conversation, right? Well, I mean, I think I can answer that two ways. One, because I think that teachers and classrooms oftentimes are engaging in translingual or translanguaging assessments all of the time. And Carla was a dual language bilingual teacher, and then she's one of the people who I've learned how to do some of these things from, right? So I think that teachers are already doing a lot of these things in classrooms, but oftentimes aren't getting the support they need to really make sense of that data. So I think the first step would be to think about formative assessments and how teachers are using formative assessments and the role of translanguaging or translingualism in those formative assessments and how teachers should then interpret those assessments. I think the harder conversation, the one where I think all of us get more pushback on, is then what does that mean for summative assessments, right? And I do think that moving more towards a kind of translingual orientation to summative assessments is actually more aligned to the Common Core and other state standards than current standardized assessments that are very removed from actual audiences and tasks and authentic purposes, right? So I think in some ways the current assessment regime isn't actually aligned with the standards that they're supposed to be assessing. And that we do need new types of assessments that are actually aligned with assessing and understanding how students are kind of thinking about audience and purpose and task. But I think that's a harder conversation to have. I think the more immediate conversation that I do think can be really impactful for teachers is what they do with formative assessments in their classrooms and how they think about language architecture and translanguaging and translingualism in their use of formative assessments.
Thank you. Okay, so next question. How can we implement the language architecture practice in class where most students are speaking one language, i.e. English, while there are a few students who can speak more than one language, i.e. class composition that reflects the average percentage of bilingual students, approximately 10%?
Right, and the follow-up is similar. I think they're both the same. I actually have a slide in my longer presentation where I have the question of like, what happens if students speak multiple languages? And I think that for me, language architecture is a stance towards how language works. And it's a stance towards the knowledge that all students come in with. So regardless of whether there's one other language, 10 other languages, regardless of whether I speak any of those other languages or not, I can approach my students as if they're knowledgeable, as if they know how language works, as if they have the understanding of how to manipulate language for specific purposes. And I can tap into that knowledge when I'm trying to build on, when I'm trying to introduce them to new ideas, right? So that may mean asking the students, right? How would you say this in your language? And I did that as a high school teacher. I do that now. Many of my students now speak languages other than English, and we oftentimes will have conversations about what are ways of saying that in your other languages, right? As a kind of point of entry to acknowledging that, one, they have other languages that they speak, and that two, that the knowledge they have of those other languages is integral to their engagement with me in English, even if I don't speak those languages, right? And so I think that for me, it's more the stance that matters rather than who the students are, because once you have that stance, it's going to lead you to positioning your students differently, positioning your students as experts and knowledgeable, and that may allow you then to tap into their knowledge in ways that maybe you wouldn't have considered before.
Nelson, have you ever encountered like an online repository of translingual text that teachers can access?
So actually, I'll just spell the organization because it's kind of weird. So maybe we can type it into here too.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to type it into the chat.
CUNY-NYSIEB, CUNY-NYSIB, I mean, just
Okay.
dash, right? Has a website that includes tons of resources on how to incorporate translanguaging, but also has resources on translingual text, possible translingual text. So if you Google that website, I think it's cuny-nysib.org. There are resources there that you can use. They have like strategies for translingualism and translanguaging, and they have kind of a repository of different texts that you might be able to use.
Awesome.
And I think there was another question. Oh, could you share the slides? I mean, I don't know how you could share. I'm happy to share them. I don't know how we would.
Was it part of the PowerPoint that you shared?
Yes.
Okay, let me try to access it while others weigh in with any questions you might have.
I'm happy to share. You can also email me. I mean, that might be easier. If you want the slides, I'm happy. If you email me, I'm happy to send them to you. So they're going to email me, so I think that don't have to worry about it.
Okay.
And anyone else can email me too with follow-up questions and things like that that may come up later. Would you happen to?
Oh, did you not send it to the?
The question from Morgan Lee, not off the top of my head, but I can get back to you on that. I have to look back in my notes. But if you email me, I'm happy to give you their names. But off the top of my head, I don't know them. I'll have to look at my notes.
And the question was, would you happen to have the names of the deaf scholars? We referenced? Let me switch forward. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, then I'll switch over to concluding our presentation. So our next webinar is happening on January 30th from 3 to 4 p.m., where 2 state leaders from the Ohio Department of Education will share their work on supporting English learners with disabilities. So we'll send out a Zoom registration link to all the participants of this webinar, or to all the people who RSVP'd for this webinar for the next webinar. And then finally, we will present our cumulative findings across CSAIL's 4 studies at a 2-day conference in Washington, D.C., actually more like Arlington, Virginia, May 27th and 28th, 2020. So if you'd like more information on anything we talked about, Nelson will be one of the presenters. Please visit CSAIL2020.org to sign up to learn more information about the conference. So if that's it, thank you again, Nelson, for joining us and for spreading your wisdom with us. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you all at our next webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.